Near the end of National Lampoon's Vacation, Clark Griswold shows up at a theme park wearing a Marty Moose hat and carrying a BB gun, and he forces an employee at gunpoint to open the gates. It is completely unhinged, deeply funny, and it almost distracts you from the real star of the film, which was never Chevy Chase. It was an avocado green station wagon with 8 headlights, fake wood paneling, and the aerodynamic profile of a garden shed. The Wagon Queen family truckster did not just carry the Griswolds across America, it carried the entire premise of 1980s beater comedy on its chrome bumpers. What most people miss is that the cars in these films were never prop afterthoughts. They were character decisions, and some of the best ones were accidental, nearly replaced, or quietly destroyed before anyone thought to ask what happened to them. 10 cars, 10 films, 10 stories that go a lot deeper than the jokes. Harold Ramis directed National Lampoon's Vacation on a budget of around $15 million, with John Hughes adapting his own short story for the screenplay, and when it opened on July 29, 1983, across 1,175 venues, it landed at number 1 on its opening weekend with over $8.3 million in ticket sales. By the end of its domestic run, the film had cleared $60 million in the US alone. Solid numbers for any comedy. But here is the detail that changes how you read the whole film. The Wagon Queen family truckster was not sourced from a lot or a rental fleet. It was commissioned from scratch. George Barris, the legendary customizer behind the original Batmobile and hundreds of other Hollywood builds, designed and fabricated the car from a base 1979 Ford LTD Country Squire, which was already a deeply uncool vehicle by 1983. A 4.9-liter V8 producing a barely there 129 horsepower, a body the size of a studio apartment, and the kind of fake wood paneling that communicates, wordlessly but clearly, that someone has given up on personal style. Barris took all of that and made it worse, deliberately and brilliantly, fitting it with 8 headlights, a grille nearly sealed shut by bodywork, with 2 apologetic little openings near the bumper, and an avocado metallic green paint scheme that looked like a disagreement between olive drab and pure envy. 5 of these cars were built for production. You would think, given how iconic the Wagon Queen family truckster became, that at least one example survived into a museum or a private collection. Almost certainly none did. No confirmed car has surfaced in any documented auction or institutional collection, which means the vehicle that anchored one of the most profitable comedies of 1983 was, in all likelihood, scrapped. The Griswolds drove America's most famous station wagon into oblivion, and then someone sent the actual wagons to the crusher. That is either very on-brand or genuinely depressing, depending on your mood. The truckster works because it is not just ugly, it is aspirationally ugly. The kind of car that results when a man who loves his family slightly more than he loves his own judgment walks onto a lot and buys the wrong thing with complete sincerity. Every dent, every mismatched panel, every cloud of exhaust functions as a character note. And Barris understood that, Hughes understood it, and the audience understood it instantly. Uncle Buck opened on August 16, 1989, and pulled $79.2 million worldwide, with John Candy playing Buck Russell, a man of spectacular personal chaos, who arrives to babysit his brother's kids in something that sounds like a military exercise and looks like it lost a fight with a parking garage. The car is a 1977 Mercury Marquis Brougham, and to be completely clear, this vehicle is a masterpiece of chosen poverty. Riding on a 124-inch wheelbase and weighing approximately 4,500 pounds, the 1977 Mercury Marquis Brougham carried a standard 460 cubic inch V8, producing 197 horsepower, which sounds respectable until you realize that engine is moving nearly 2.25 tons of American steel through Chicago suburbs. Consumer guide Auto 77 listed that 460 as one of the 5 most powerful American car engines of its model year, and the EPA rated it at 11 miles per gallon in city driving, which means every scene featuring that Mercury Marquis Brougham is, in a technical sense, a small ecological event. The screen version features smoking exhaust, a chronic backfire, interior upholstery in advanced stages of dissolution, coachwork that has clearly survived several incidents nobody documented, and a CB ball mount antenna bolted to the rear driver's quarter panel, like an afterthought made of chrome. Every time the Mercury Marquis Brougham rolled into frame, audiences laughed before Candy delivered a single line because the car preloaded the joke on his behalf. Here is the part that should bother historians of this film. Filming began on January 4th, 1989 in Chicago, but the production was originally planned for St. Louis, and the reason it moved north is that the winter of 1988 ran unseasonably warm down there. Chicago winters are not known for mercy, and that cold and gray became part of the film's texture in ways a mild Missouri spring simply would not have replicated. The Mercury Marquis Brougham belching exhaust into a frozen Chicago morning is a specific, irreplaceable image, and it only exists because of a weather anomaly. The current whereabouts of the screen-used Marquis are not publicly documented, which, given how beloved this film remains, represents a genuine gap in automotive film history. John Hughes wrote, produced, and directed Planes, Trains, and Automobiles on a $15 million budget, opened it on November the 25th, 1987, and watched it earn $49.5 million across its domestic run through January 1988. It is the warmest film Hughes ever made. It also contains a sequence where Steve Martin and John Candy drive a car that is actively on fire down a freeway while arguing about it, which tells you something about Hughes's range. The rental car at the center of that sequence is a late 80s American sedan, a Dodge-type vehicle representative of the era's standard rental fleet, boxy, beige, and completely anonymous in every way that matters, until Del Griffith's carelessly discarded cigarette turns it into a rolling bonfire. The car carries no name and no personality, and that is entirely the point, because it represents the bureaucratic normalcy that Del's chaos consumes wherever it travels. What most viewers do not catch during that scene is the sign visible in the background as Martin and Candy stand watching their transportation burn. It reads Chicago, 106 miles, and Hughes placed it there deliberately as a reference to the Blues Brothers, which John Landis had filmed in Chicago years earlier. It is a note left for the people paying attention, the kind of detail that rewards a second viewing of a film you thought you already knew. The first cut of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles ran 3 hours and 45 minutes, because Hughes and Candy and Martin improvised extensively throughout production, and Hughes kept nearly all of it. What exists in the finished film is a disciplined edit of something much larger, which means somewhere in the footage is more Candy, more Martin, more burned cars, and more of an America that no longer quite exists. The loss of that material is, in its own quiet way, worth mourning. The rental sedan itself was not preserved. It was a working prop destroyed on cue for a gag, with no auction record, no restoration project, and no surviving example. The fire was real, the comedy was real, and then the crew swept up what remained and moved on. Here is where things get genuinely interesting. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is universally remembered as the film with the Ferrari, and that reputation rests on a fiction running 3 layers deep, which I find honestly fascinating every time I think about it. The car used in the 1986 production is not a Ferrari, and never was. Even by the mid-1980s, Paramount Pictures was not sourcing a genuine 1961 Ferrari 250 GT California for a film where the plot required it to exit a garage window at speed because a real 250 GT California was already worth hundreds of thousands of dollars by that point. So Hughes read about a California company called Modena Design and Development, founded by Neil Glassmoyer and Mark Goyette, in a car magazine, and he called them. According to the account that has circulated in automotive circles since the film's release, Glassmoyer initially hung up, convinced the call was a prank, and Hughes phoned back to secure the commission. A hung-up phone call and a magazine ad changed the course of a film that a generation would remember as featuring one of cinema's most iconic vehicles. Modena built 3 replicas for the production, 2 functional driving cars, and 1 non-runner, constructed specifically to be destroyed in the finale. The functional hero car featured a fiberglass body formed largely from MG underpinning, a V8 sourced from a 1974 Ford Torino, front suspension adapted to Ford Mustang A-arms with torsion bars, a Ford Mustang solid rear axle at the back, a windshield pulled from a Fiat Spider 124, and taillights sourced from a Volkswagen Type 3. Close-up speedometer shots used a Jaguar E-Type instrument cluster. Assembled from Ford, Fiat, Volkswagen, MG, and Jaguar components, it is arguably the most international car in Hollywood history, and not one element of it is Italian. You would expect a replica assembled from that many donor vehicles to look compromised on screen, but it does not, and that is either a credit to Modena's craftsmanship or proof that the 1961 Ferrari 250 GT California silhouette is so close to perfect that it survives translation into fiberglass and American V8 without losing its authority. The hero car sold at auction in 2020 for $396,000 and a second replica cleared $313,000, including fees at the Bonhams Amelia Island auction. By December 2022, one of the Modena replicas had entered the collection at the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation through the Hagerty Drivers Foundation's National Historic Vehicle Register program. And that same month, the crash prop replica appeared at Heritage Auctions with an opening bid of $100,000. The dark footnote to all of this is that after Ferris Bueller's Day Off performed at the box office, Ferrari pursued legal action against Modena Design and Development for trademark violations related to their replica business, and the legal fees destroyed the company entirely. Glassmoyer and Goyette built the car that made the film. The film's success made them a target. They did not survive it. Hughes originally planned the vehicle to be a Mercedes, by the way, and a magazine ad and a failed first phone call are the only reason that did not happen. The transition from there is almost too clean, because the next cars on this list were not destroyed by lawyers or fire. They were lost to time, neglect, and the specific American habit of discarding the things that turned out to matter most. Jake Ryan drives a Rolls-Royce in 16 Candles, which qualifies as neither a beater nor a comedy car by any conventional measure, and the comedy arrives entirely from context. A 1966 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud 3, one of the most formally dignified automobiles ever produced, sits outside a suburban Chicago church while a teenager in a party dress attempts not to pass out from excitement nearby. The car takes itself completely seriously, and that unshakable self-regard is precisely what makes the sequence funny. Hughes understood that the right vehicle in the wrong setting functions as its own punchline, and the Silver Cloud 3 operates as the premium version of the joke the Wagon Queen family truckster makes at the opposite end of the budget spectrum. One costs everything. One costs nothing, and both are equally absurd in the worlds they have been placed into. The 1985 Val Kilmer comedy Real Genius features a Dodge delivery van that becomes, through a sequence of escalating scientific miscalculations, an inadvertent popcorn delivery system when a laser fills a professor's house with popped corn and the vehicle disappears under the overflow. The van itself is unremarkable, a standard commercial delivery vehicle of the early 1980s, white, boxy, and functionally anonymous in every direction. What makes it memorable is that its destruction is entirely collateral, because nobody aimed anything at that van. The van simply existed in the wrong location, when physics lost its composure. That is a specific register of beater comedy, where the car is not the joke, but the victim. And Real Genius understood the difference instinctively. John Landis directed Spies Like Us in 1985, and the film's third act features a fleet of Soviet-era military vehicles being driven badly by Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd through what is supposed to be Central Asia. The vehicles are operational military surplus, rough and loud and clearly maintained by optimism rather than spare parts. And they backfire on cue, stall at the worst possible moments, and look exactly like something two American spies should absolutely not be operating. The comedy of military hardware in civilian hands is a register that 1980s comedy returned to repeatedly, and Landis trusted the vehicles to carry the absurdity without any additional assistance. They delivered. Better Off Dead starred John Cusack in 1985 and centered on a decrepit Camaro that his character spends the film attempting to restore to working condition. The car is barely functional for most of its screen time, backfiring and refusing to start, and leaking something that nobody investigates too closely, and it operates as a beater by aspiration, a car that believes it will eventually be great and has no evidence whatsoever to support that belief. The gap between what the Camaro actually is and what its owner believes it could become carries more of the film's emotional weight than the script probably intended. Honestly, I was rooting for that Camaro in a way I did not anticipate, and it earns it by the final act. Rob Reiner's 1985 road comedy The Sure Thing sends John Cusack across the country via a succession of increasingly improbable vehicles, none of which belong to him and none of which are good. A rusted-out pickup driven by a couple who communicate exclusively through folk songs is not a car chase or a stunt sequence. It is a character test administered through transportation, and the vehicles in this film function collectively as antagonists that Cusack survives through persistence rather than competence. The comedy lives in the gap between the dignity of the journey and the indignity of every single ride. Chris Columbus directed Adventures in Babysitting in 1987, and Elizabeth Shue spends the film navigating a genuinely dangerous Chicago night alongside a group of children and a Ford Taurus wagon that accumulates damage at a pace that should have totaled it before the second act closes. The Taurus wagon is a deeply sensible family car being subjected to profoundly unsensible circumstances, including a flat tire on a freeway, an unscheduled visit to a chop shop, and a confrontation that has no business involving a suburban station wagon. The car does not quit, and that persistence becomes something close to a character note because the Ford Taurus wagon was built for the suburbs and it survived the city anyway. Across all 10 of these films, the pattern holds without exception. The beater car is never just transportation. It is a mirror, reflecting the distance between where a character believes they are and where they actually stand. The Wagon Queen family truckster tells you Clark Griswold loves his family more than he values his own dignity. The Mercury Marquis Brougham tells you Buck Russell is not quite ready for responsible adulthood. The burning rental sedan tells you Del Griffith converts every situation into an emergency and somehow makes that quality charming. The Modena Replica tells you Cameron Fry is terrified of being seen for what he is, so he hides behind what his father values instead. The 1980s comedy beater was never the worst car available. It was always the most honest one on the lot. Detroit spent the 1970s producing these vehicles in enormous quantities, and Hollywood spent the 1980s turning them into a language that audiences read instinctively without knowing they were reading anything at all.